Welcome to another episode of Further Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here again with my fellow Breakpoint writer, Kasey Leander, to talk more about my conversation with Nathan Rittenhouse about why you likely won't change the world in your 20s and why that's okay. Kasey, welcome back to Upstream. I gather you and Nathan are old chums.
Nathan is indeed a very dear friend of mine. Shane, we go way back to the ministry we're working at before I was with the Colson Center. We've done a number of university missions together. So you're just together for a whole week, doing talks, hosting Q&As, reaching out to students. And Nathan Rittenhouse is one of the best just human beings alive on the planet today. So in fact, after one of those university missions, he wrote just a little note card. He wrote to me and my friend Matthew. He said, "Gentlemen, I am proud of ye. I'm proud to say that we framed that and we were housemates. We put it on the wall of our house for the rest of our tenure there." So gave me daily inspiration looking at it.
Did he really say proud of ye?
Ye. Yeah, it wasn't you. It was ye.
That's amazing. Yeah, he puts off this kind of classically educated Amish farm hand vibe. There's just something about him that seems so rural, and yet he's so astute on a wide number of subjects. It's just like, it's an interesting combination.
Yeah, if the apocalypse happens, I know right where I'm going. It's Nathan's house in West Virginia. And also, if I had to trust one person I know to like single-handedly build a rocket to get to outer space, it would also be Nathan Rittenhouse. So, you know, there's nothing he can't do. He's incredible.
It's like he could lecture you on physics and philosophy while helping you like make cheese or churn butter or something.
He's one of a kind. And his beard is only rivaled by our colleague, Glenn Sunshine.
I don't know, but I mean, Glenn's beard is like 1.5 feet long at this point. He's graduated into full Eastern Orthodox priest / Istari wizard territory.
Absolutely.
I don't know how long Nathan's is now, but yeah, I mean, he had kind of the Abe Lincoln look going when I saw him, but that was like 2 summers ago.
Yeah. I always respect a good beard. So,
well, I try to give respect to the good beards and keep the jealousy out of my response every time I see one, because the fact is I just cannot grow a good beard. And if I tried, it would look pathetic. So I won't give that a shot. But I mean, enough about beards. This subject is just, I knew when I heard him talk about it, that it was going to have a big impact on the students who were hearing him. And then it had a big impact on me as well. And I thought this was a subject that just, it's not addressed enough. And I think it has a potential to, it sounds insulting at first. It's like, well, you're not going to change your 20s, just give up on it. But it's not. It's actually extremely freeing and liberating in a way. And I wanted to ask you right at the beginning here, what kinds of pressures you experienced and just sort of felt implicitly when you were trying to figure life out in your 20s? Because I remember looking back and thinking, gosh, I got to figure everything out in the next couple of months. I have to figure out where I'm going to go to college, what my career is going to be like, what my life trajectory is. And if I screw this up, I'm toast forever. Like the pressure was immense.
Right. We've talked before, Shane. I think you and I had pretty similar backgrounds where there's just a segment of homeschooling that is deeply good, I think, but kind of prepares you to try to think outside the box on a lot of things. And, I was told often by friends and just people in my life, coaches and whatnot, like, you're the generation that gives me hope for America. So that's one thing that I think I wrestled with.
The prodigy effect.
Right. In this last episode, by no means was I a prodigy, but I think I felt the weight of that statement. And it's a mixed bag. So I think you and I have that in common, trying to wrestle through that. And it just doesn't, practically, what do? I think you end up trying to do, by God's grace, hopefully, some of the same things that you would just do anyway. Just be faithful, in other words, in the moment. But the temptation is delusions of grandeur. And I think for me, social media in my early 20s too. And by the way, I'm still in my 20s. So I'm 29, coming up on 30 come June. So I'm kind of the baby of the Colson Center.
So this summer, we'll be able to take you seriously for the first time.
It's amazing that I'm on this podcast too. I kind of snuck in on this one. So feel free to disregard anything I'm going to say. But yeah, no, I think as I'm nearing 30, this is a very relevant discussion, actually, to look back at the last decade and just say, yeah, some of that pressure was really unhealthy. And I think social media is a huge piece of it too. Yeah.
And that's the social media aspect allows you to be performative and show off and just be a turd in public. And that's something that I definitely struggled with over the course of my, intellectual and spiritual development. But early on, that prodigy effect that I referred to. And it's not even necessary for you to actually be especially meritorious in any area. Like, you don't actually have to have special skills. If you, like I said, if you can put a few words together, if you can put a few thoughts together in front of people and sound good, people will latch onto you. Other Christians will latch onto you. I think especially there is a segment of like middle-aged to elderly Christian women who will just praise you in a way that I think is very well-meaning on their part. But unfortunately, it can have the effect of either pressuring or inflating the heads of young people who are just like, who hear things like, you're the generation that's gonna turn this country around. It's kind of the Generation Joshua mentality, right? And I have nothing against that program. I know so many young men and women who came out of there and just were just freight trains for the Lord. But the downside of all that is that sometimes you can feel that pressure or get that overinflated sense of self and just think, well, I'm the best thing since sliced bread. I'm going to actually change the world just by virtue of my my unique skills. And that's actually, not only can it expose you to the dangers of ego or whatever, but it actually is contrary to the processes that need to go on in a young person's life for them to develop the character, the experience, and the wisdom necessary to actually be a good leader later on. So, and that's the difference between, like, you see the difference between someone who has had a lot of what they call book learning and then someone who's had a lot of life learning. And I was just reading a book about this recently where the comparison was made between the two, where there's someone who has learned all the right answers in a sort of academic setting and can rattle them off versus someone who knows experientially what's right and what's wise and what's noble and can live it as a matter of second nature. And ideally, you want the two to go together. But if you have to choose, you want the experiential one. You don't necessarily want someone who just knows the answers but doesn't know how to put them into practice. And that attitude of, you are the chosen one, you're going to save the world, you're going to change everything, often keeps you from developing precisely those skills, which often happen in the school of hard knocks, right? They happen through difficult experience in your early 20s. And that stood out to me because it seems like Nathan is open to that harder school of experience-based wisdom and would prefer it even over the more academic, sort of theoretical book learning type of wisdom. Yeah.
It's like the sense of purpose is good. And I'm personally very grateful for that and the many kind people who helped instill that in me and say, your life matters and what you do matters. You can be a leader among your peers, etc. But yeah, when it gives way to a sense of entitlement or a sense of delusions of grandeur, I think that's bad. And I was going to say, Shane, we have examples in public culture of leaders who, in my opinion, just shouldn't be out there leading, even if they're doing something good. But I just thought of two people, Kyle Rittenhouse being one, who went to the Kenosha protests and ended up shooting two different people in self-defense. He's 18 years old. He's 19 years old. Kyle Rittenhouse, but then also Greta Thunberg, who is a very well-intentioned young lady, and I applaud her passion and her courage to speak to a lot of adults on these issues. But both of those teenagers, I just couldn't help but think about this, Shane. Both of them have been elevated to a global platform on, gun rights and, saving the earth. And
I'll add a third one, David Hogg from right here in Florida. After the Parkland shooting, he becomes this gun control crusader. And I don't think that's necessarily, I don't think like a student whose peers were victims of a mass shooting becoming a public figure is necessarily a bad thing. It's the way that he goes about it and this sort of immense arrogance and overconfidence and just the moral certainty with which he denounces people who disagree with him. That's sort of playing into the same dynamic you're talking about.
Yeah, and 18-year-olds are like that. I mean, I know I was. I just think what we need to cultivate is a culture like the adults around them, almost like you have a responsibility to Greta and to Kyle to make sure that they're not, out there like spearheading a movement that they're not emotionally equipped to understand the nuances of.
Yeah. This plays into a larger dynamic, I guess, beyond the Christian world, beyond the NCFCAs and the Generation Joshua type programs and the generalized cult of youth that I referred to at the beginning of the discussion with Nathan, that there's this Rousseauian kind of sense that young people are intrinsically more virtuous somehow, that they're uncorrupted. And this is something that you see go deep into American history, where this is a political move, right? You bring out the kids and you just sort of show them supporting your cause, whether it's climate change action or gun control or whatever. You bring this young, fresh-faced teenager or 20-something out there and get them to parrot your talking points. And well, number one, it's politically advantageous because whoever responds to them automatically looks like a jerk, right? Because they're just punching down. They're beating up on a kid, right? They're just a kid. Leave them alone. But number two, I think there's this deeper sense, and I do think it comes from Rousseau, or at least it involves him, this instinct that we have in the modern world that young people are actually, not only are they innocent and pure in their opinions, but they actually have an intrinsic wisdom of a sort, or intrinsic goodness that gets trained out of them by society. They're corrupted as time goes on, but initially, from the mouth of babes. There's even that's a reference in Scripture. There is this sense, I think, that childhood has innocence, but of course, Scripture tempers that with constant reminders of the foolishness of children and the impetuosity of youth and so forth. But the modern world really is convinced that young people know something that old people have forgotten, and they need to bestow their wisdom upon us, and then we need to just shut up and listen to them, regardless of what they say.
Yeah, and you see that from the ways that we're just running away from old age as well, as hard and fast as we can. But I loved Nathan's reminder, just that it's okay. It's okay to age. Not only is it okay not to change the world in your 20s, it's okay to age. Another friend of mine, Sam Albury, recently said on a different podcast, he said, I love every decade of life more than the previous one because I'm just so much less dumb than I was in the previous decade. Yeah. I had to laugh at that. I'm glad for that. That gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's my experience as well. My 20s were definitely a time when I look back on so much and I just cringe. And a lot of that's preserved for posterity on the internet. So I guess I could delete it or purge it, but I kind of look back and I just go, that's an important lesson. Remember that, Shane. Or when Facebook shows me a memory or something, it's like, you know what? When you first became a Calvinist, you said a lot of stupid stuff. And that sort of should live in my memory as a constant reminder that I'm capable of great foolishness and that I should temper my behavior even now on that basis of that knowledge.
I was going to ask, Shane, in your conversation with Nathan, you guys talked about how you have these 5-year plans, and you make these. For you at age 18, where did you see yourself, and what ended up happening? What got derailed? What went, how you thought it would, if anything? How'd that journey go for you?
Yeah, I think I imagined that I would do a kind of politically related job. It'd be some kind of spokesperson or speechwriter, and then I would moonlight writing fantasy novels. No joke. I really wanted to be the next Brandon Sanderson or the next Robert Jordan or something like that. Yeah, and I guess that dream is still in there somewhere, but my plans didn't exactly stick with my initial assumption of how things would go. And it ended up being this really formative blessing of just spending a lot of time bouncing around internships and then ending up with the Colson Center. So it wasn't even called the Colson Center back then, but writing Breakpoints has just given me I like to tell people it's given me such an education. It's and you've been at this for what, a year and a half, almost 2 years?
Right.
And isn't that true? It's you are thinking through and analyzing so many different subjects in the news from a Christian perspective. And it's like a course in and of itself every month. And then you come out of it and you're like, wow, I feel like I've studied at a college level this stuff. It's like reading C.S. Lewis, there's a little bit of everything constantly.
And for you, Shane, you didn't start writing Breakpoints for John Stone Street. You started writing them for Chuck Colson. How many years did you write for Chuck, and what was that experience like for you?
So I came on as an intern in 2010, and I think I wrote my first Breakpoint for him in the spring of 2011. Of course, he passes away in the spring of 2012. So yeah, it was a short little window there. But the thanks really goes to David Carlson, who, and we're kind of off subject here, but I will drop his name as one of the most important formative figures in my career, in my life. And this goes into the mentorship thing that Nathan sort of alluded to in our conversation. But David really, he was the editor of Breakpoint for many, many years, really encouraged me to get out there and attempt to write these commentaries, tackle a variety of subjects, and just be willing to fall down flat and embarrass myself for the sake of learning. And boy, he was just an excellent editor and an encouraging guy to work with. So that, and together with Chuck writing me personal notes going, thank you so much for, I really enjoyed this commentary. I thought it was spot on, Shane. Good job. Like a little personalized note. I've got those put away, of course, and framed because it's just so great. But that was a big encouragement for me. And then I just, of course, continued to write when Eric Metaxas was doing the commentary. And then through all those years, as John came in and began to lead the organization once Chuck had passed away. Yeah, that was just super formative. And I look back and I think there's no way I would be confident in talking about the things that I'm confident in talking about now if I hadn't written those hundreds and hundreds of breakpoints about this variety of subjects and been present when the editor or the host has to come back and say, you really missed it on this one. You gotta go back to the drawing board and try again, buddy.
Right. That's one of the reasons I'm so grateful for Stone Street and, Tim Pageant and our whole editorial team, because for me, this really is a learning experience. Even as we do our best to bring cultural commentary, it's like, I'm not going to get it right. And I'm grateful for a system we have in place where we really are writing these together as a team. And to me, that makes all the difference. So I'm grateful for that piece. I didn't set that system up. I'm just benefiting from it, as one of the newer writers on the team.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to ask you this, Kasey, because we're telling our own stories here. We're sort of looking back on how these principles have worked out in our own lives or not worked out in our own lives, and how, say, a listener in their early 20s or late high school years right now could alter their plans based on that. And Nathan really emphasized pacing yourself. He has this illustration of his coach reaching out and grabbing his jersey on the cross country race and just going, hey, slow down there, buddy. You're going to flame out if you don't learn how to run this distance. This is not a sprint. This is much different. You have to really keep some gas in the tank. What does it mean to pace yourself in terms of making plans for career and calling versus family? Because this is a subject I think a lot of people in the millennial generation did not think about, and a lot of young people in the Gen Z cohort are not thinking about either. And that's much to their detriment, because they'll get to a certain point in their lives and realize, oh my gosh, I've given no thought to this stuff. Family requires some planning and foresight and intentionality. So if you want to be a husband, you want to be a wife, you want to be a father, you want to be a mother, these are things that you can't just imagine will magically happen. Like they have to be goals that you've worked toward and invested effort in. What does it look like to pace yourself with those two often sort of divergent sets of priorities?
I don't know if I can speak to the family side, Shane. I'm only recently married, by God's grace. That was a longer process for me, not for lack of a desire on that one, but he just had a plan. I was going to meet my wife at the end of my 20s, not the beginning. So I'll let you speak to the family side. But I would say if I were going to just talk to my younger self about career, I wouldn't probably do many things different, but I would stress out way less about it. And I even had a mentor tell me that. I just asked him, I'm like, it feels like if I let my death grip go on trying to just be as good as I can be, I'm going to lose out. And I'll never forget what he said. He's like, you're not going to lose out on anything that actually matters. And this is a guy in his 50s, really successful in the Christian world, produced a lot of different things, like the Truth Project. He was involved in that. And just was like, man, I'm taking that to the bank. Because it's true. I think our anxiety about the future, the kind of anxiety that feeling like you have to change the world in your 20s produces, does not actually lead to anything productive. It doesn't actually make you more excellent, I think. In the short term, maybe. But for me, I think in the long term, it's the love that God puts in our hearts towards being faithful, towards positive change we see in other people's lives, towards just learning itself. It's all those positive values that drive me to excellence on those days when I even get close to it. You know what I mean? And versus the anxiety that I think I'm tempted to slip into gives me nothing. But so that's what I would say about career. I don't think I do many things differently. But family, I like what you're saying. I think it's a different perspective on it. I'm curious to hear how you would answer that.
Well, I wrote a column a few years ago, and it was actually sort of formatted as a letter to my oldest daughter, Astrid. And she's 10 now. I guess at the time she was probably like 6 or 7. And it was titled something like, "Dear Astrid, don't put family on the back burner." And the way that I kind of phrased it was, look, we're in a time when everyone's going to tell you that you need to invest very heavily in education and career, and that if marriage and family are things that you want to pursue, that those things are just going to happen. They're going to sort of magically fall into place, and you're going to get to the finish line of whatever your professional pursuits are, and then there's just going to be like an ideal man waiting there for you, ready to say, all right, let's partner up and have a family. And the point that I kind of want to instill in her as she gets older and matures toward womanhood, and the point that I think a lot of young women and men need to think about, is that these things do not happen by accident. They're actually the result of intentionality. And you cannot put the identity you want to have as a mother, father, husband, wife on the back burner and then just expect it to happen later in life, because it's not going to happen. And we have statistics that prove there's this massive cohort of young people who are getting to a certain point in their lives and going, oh, shoot, that didn't just pan out the way I thought it would. I've invested in my professional self or my academic self and neglected to seek out becoming a member of a family. Like, I want that. And obviously there are going to be a few people in every generation, a certain percentage, who are not aiming to start a family. They're not aiming to be married and have children. And so they shouldn't have to invest in those goals. But the fact is the vast majority do want those things, have always wanted those things, and will have to pursue those things if we're going to keep this thing called society going, right? It's not magic. As you know, a colleague of ours likes to say, it's math. It's just math. And so this is especially potent, for young women. And this is something that is not politically correct to say, but it's just, again, this is not magic. It's science in this case. And the fact is that, women have less time to become mothers than men have to become fathers. The Bible is full of examples of this, right? Like, Abraham is how old when he fathers Ishmael, and then Isaac later on through a miracle in his wife Sarah. But the fact is that the age limitation for childbearing falls primarily on women. That biological clock is a real thing. And so if you want to have kids and you want to have more than one or two kids, you do have to think about that. You do have to think, okay, when am I going to start doing this? Or at least when am I going to aim toward doing this? So I think it's, that intentionality is something, but that's going to require some sacrifices, because you cannot, you can't divide yourself infinitely in both directions. And that's a process you have to reckon with. Like, you have to be serious about the realities there.
As you're talking, Shane, I almost want to come at that from a slightly different side. I think I agree with the core of what you're saying. But in the conversation with Nathan Rittenhouse, you said something that I've been chewing on since. You said, you got to trade some of your potential reality for some actual reality. We all start off as just bundles of limitless potential. I could be an astronaut. I could be a dentist. Well, probably not both at the same time, right? Like, if you're going to be a dentist, you got to give up being an astronaut, which means getting almost rid of that idealism a little bit for some practical steps that you would take. How that relates to dating to me is, I think maybe the problem isn't that young people don't want to be married. I wonder if they have this idealistic version of what marriage or relationships can be, along the lines of thinking they have to change the world in their 20s, right? So it's almost the same problem. They think, I have to find my perfect spouse or else I'm not going to get married. Well, the problem with that is that, and you said this, if you don't use your potential, you're going to become somebody. You're just going to become someone who's not very good at different things. Like, you're going to essentially waste your potential unless you invest it. To me, that just makes me think young people, it's okay to have that as a goal. They probably should, but it's almost like the same problem with career. You can't control the perfect outcome. All you can do is take steps of faithfulness along that route. And, for me, I'd even just say as a disclaimer to people listening to this who are single, I got married at 28. My wife was 31 when we got married. And both of us, I think, wanted marriage, But in God's plan and his reality, that's when we were going to meet each other.
Well, for what it's worth, you were actually a year below the average age at which American men get married.
Got it.
So you still came in ahead.
I made it. Whew, that's good. I long to be average, and I'm so glad. No, yeah, and yeah, like in the grand scheme of things, it's like this combination of like, we can't control outcomes. You can't actually decide to change the world in your 20s. You can only be faithful. And I think likewise, my reaction to what you're saying is that's so true. You also can't decide, to find the right person to marry in your 20s. You can just be faithful in taking steps, like real concrete, practical steps towards, I don't know, asking people out, trying to find a way to do that with integrity in a dating culture that's deeply shattered and broken. And there's no script for how we do it. It's like, there's practical, faithful steps we can be taking. And the world is actually desperate for us to take. The alternative, though, is to sit on ideals and idealism and never cash that in for anything real.
Yeah, this practical step point that you're making is so crucial. And there have been a number of books on this over the years. So a few years ago, Kevin DeYoung wrote this book called Just Do Something. And it was I think it was a contribution, in many ways, the defining contribution to this ongoing discussion in evangelical and especially Reformed circles about discerning God's will. And I remember vividly having this discussion with a number of peers at this church I was attending in kind of late in high school and early college years, especially with this one young lady who we just talked about everything you can imagine, like debated and talked. And it was just, very wide ranging. But one of the ongoing discussions we had was she kind of had this idea that, look, God does have a specific providential plan for your life. And you have to be very open to his signals for his will and following his will and reaching his plan. And if you don't, you can actually miss out on his best for you, that you have these cues that'll come into your life and you have to pick up on them. And I don't want to misrepresent her, but it was a very specific sort of idea about God's will. And my argument was, no, it's actually very difficult to step outside God's will if all you're doing is obeying him morally. Like if you're doing what's right in front of you, you're making choices based on your wisdom and just trying to do what's right. You're not sinning, right? You're not rebelling against him. Then he's big and powerful enough to work out the details. And in fact, there may be multiple valid options that God has before you where you could choose either one. And he doesn't, in the decretive sense, he cares because he sort of orchestrates all things. You never give him the slip. Like he's way ahead of you. But in the sort of moral sense, either one's fine. Like if you want to become a doctor or a lawyer, God's fine with either one. And he actually genuinely wants you to make a choice there and just be faithful with what you're doing. And eventually, I think we kind of came into more of an agreement along the lines of what DeYoung writes. But his thing is, don't be crippled by these kinds of choices. Just do something and trust God with the results. And this goes back to something Augustine says what was his saying? It was that you should love God and do what you will, because love will never do anything to offend the beloved. And that's a kind of radically freeing approach, not just to, what career you're going to choose, like the doctor and lawyer thing, but to one of the issues that I actually remember debating about and just kind of discussing with this young lady was, what if I end up marrying the wrong person? It was a very hot topic in our circles at that point because all of us are just a bunch of awkward, homeschooled singles. And we're thinking about these questions like, oh, Lee, I don't want to miss my soulmate or whatever. And that whole question, opens up its own can of worms. Like, is there someone God has for you out there? But that's part of the decision-making process. At some point, you do have to just do something. You do have to just go to that young adults night. And that's actually how I met my wife. Was she didn't want to go out and be social. She wasn't feeling like it. And her mom goes, you know what, Gabby, you need to go to this thing, if only just to talk to people and not be a recluse tonight. And she went and we ended up meeting and, the rest is history. So sometimes just taking that step, even if you don't want to, is tremendous.
So real. And I think it plays into our conception of what kind of people God wants us to be. I mean, on one hand, we definitely should be looking for his will and we should be praying about it. I think that's something that he wants us to come to him with. But on the other hand, like it says in, I think, Ephesians 5, where it says, well, we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth on the waves. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become, in every respect, the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. So what kind of people does God want? He wants mature believers who know how to exercise wisdom and discernment while still being in conversation with the God who made them. He'll give you, like, he'll close some doors and open some others. But I think it brings him glory and honor when, 18-year-olds are going, okay, I'm not going to just, throw the fleece out per se. I'm going to develop my mind and say, given what I know right now, Lord, guide me in this decision. But it seems like wisdom would say, go here and do this. I think that brings him glory. It's like his infant children learning how to walk and moving towards, eating real spiritual meat and learning how to use the brains and the minds God's given them and exercise wisdom. There's so much to grow in those areas. And I wish someone would have grabbed me by the shirt collar at age 18 and been like, you're going to be fine. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to be fine. Just use whatever measure of wisdom God's given you to be faithful in the moment. And then, I don't know, go play Frisbee. Like, you're good. You're fine. Like, do the applications, but also don't give yourself an ulcer worrying about it.
I had a roommate during one of my internships, and he actually ended up being the best man at my wedding. But he told me something very similar along those lines, where I would just sit in the dorm at night and just sort of stew out loud to him about how I didn't know what I was going to do, and I was going to end up screwing up royally or failing at life because I had no planned out specific trajectory. And he went, Shane, you're going to be fine. I mean, you haven't gone to prison. You got a good family. You're teachable. And look at you, you're already doing these experimental summer jobs and so forth. So you're going to be fine. Just chill out and stop worrying so much. You're going to psych yourself out and mess yourself up that way. And luckily I didn't get into a self-perpetuating cycle of just worry about worrying too much. In that case, I'd have to go to Dale Carnegie. He has a great book on that. But, I think as we close here, there's one thing that the don't worry mantra helped me to really understand about our situation as millennials, and then the situation of our younger siblings, or the next generation up and coming, the Gen Z young people who right now are overwhelmingly in their 20s, right? It's that we need to have mercy on ourselves. We need to cut ourselves a little slack, because we're dealing with a situation that's fairly unique historically. It's fairly new historically. And this is something that another book, Trevin Wax's Rethink Yourself, helped bring out for me, was that for most people throughout history, most young people, their identity was highly given. Their trajectory was highly sort of determined for them externally by their families or their community or their geographic location, where they lived and what kinds of jobs were available there. I mean, a lot of them just got apprenticed and boom, that's it. Like your dad's a blacksmith, you're going to be a blacksmith, or your family wants to help you move up in a different career trajectory. They're going to apprentice you out to someone who does that. And that's your career for the rest of your life. And in some sense, that would be stifling. Like if you have a proclivity to go and be a physicist, like you have to really face a significant struggle to reach that goal, or a musician or something like that. But on another level, it could be liberating. There could be a way in which that frees you up to just think about other things in life, because you don't have the pressure of becoming someone who is, who just a unique and standout prodigy within your generation. Now we've got, not only do we have the sort of access to knowledge that lets us know about all the prodigies that are exceeding us in every possible way in life, right? The people in our generation who are doing better than us in some perceived way. But we've got transportation that can take us anywhere. We've got telecommuting jobs and education that open up all these possibilities to us. And there's a choice paralysis at some point that sets in, where we go, golly, I should be, right now by my age, I should have done this degree, and I should have gotten this job, and I should have built this kind of resume, and I haven't done these things. I'm so behind the curve. Can I ever catch up? And there's just this spiral of despair that hits you. And on some level, you just have to recognize this is uncharted territory, guys. For young people today, this is not how it was for our grandparents and our great-grandparents and every person going back to Adam before that, right? Their lives were very given. Our lives are not as given. And so that can free us in some sense to have mercy on ourselves, but it can also, you make the whole process a little bit more lighthearted. Like you're just experimenting. You're just trying to figure this thing out. You're going to land somewhere, trust God with this and have the perspective to say, I'm doing this for the first time. And if I get it wrong, well, nobody can blame me because they didn't do it like this. They didn't have all these options.
That's a good lesson for me, approaching now my 30s. I think that's just a good lesson for people at any life stage, right? Is just that the Lord is merciful towards us and we can take ourselves off the hook too. And also life is a beautiful adventure. I think of Chesterton's parable that he tells of the two brothers, one who says, make me as large as a skyscraper so I can walk across the entire earth. And he does. A genie grants his wish and he travels the entire earth in 2 weeks and he comes back and he's like, okay, I'm bored. I did everything. And then the other brother says, well, make me the size of an ant so I can stay in my little, 4 foot by 4 foot patch of earth and never get bored. And so he has his wish, right? And the truth is, and this goes back to what Nathan said, what are we impressed by? What's significant in the kingdom? And Jesus just completely flips that on its head when he says, anyone who gives a cup of water to a little one in my name will surely not lose their reward. And he says things like, a bird isn't going to fall out of a tree except that God notices it and cares. So it's like everything is significant. Who cares about changing the world? I mean, change your family dynamic. That alone is infinitely significant. We just can't quantify it. It's more significant than our finite brains can handle. If only we have eyes to see it. Like being kind to one person in one moment is an infinite amount of change that we could procure with our actions. It's like, I want to see life through that lens. And I'm grateful for people like Nathan Rittenhouse, who in this podcast and always in our friendship have challenged me to recover that sort of beauty.
Yeah, amen. And that's a reminder too of the emphasis Jesus repeatedly comes back to, that faithfulness is what God expects of us. Faithfulness with what we're given, not pursuit of ever more or of someone else's gifts and talents and resources. At the end of the day, he comes back and he has one question. It's not, how much money did you make me, servants? It's, were you faithful with what I gave you? Or did you put it in the ground and bury it? And I think that's ultimately what he's going to ask each of us. And this is, even C.S. Lewis comes back to this with the parable of Dick Firkins and Mrs. Bates, where he illustrates the fact that God does not look at people like we look at people. He can see someone who on the surface is a sophisticated, educated, well-mannered and sociable individual and say, you're actually a barbarian at heart because you've not done anything with what I gave you. You've just became like Dick Firkins, a well-mannered atheist. But when he looks at Mrs. Bates, who by nature and by breeding and upbringing is this just short-tempered, angry, sort of coarse type of person, and she becomes a Christian and makes moral progress, real effortful moral progress toward being like Christ. And in the end, she's still not as nice to be around as Dick Firkins. But Lewis says, guess what? She's a towering giant in the kingdom. And God will look at her and say, well done, good and faithful servant, because you have advanced with what you were given. Dick Firkins over here, he didn't do squat. And, he's going to depart from me, workers of iniquity, that sort of thing. And that's how it is. It's really how it is. He expects faithfulness of us. He doesn't expect a certain benchmark of success. Well, Kasey, thanks again for joining me. This was a great conversation. I look forward to many more in the future. I think this is a really great dynamic, and it's just fun to have you on the podcast to talk more about my discussions with guests. So thank you.
Shane, my privilege. Thanks for letting me go with you further upstream.